Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We don't even have the date of the referendum on Britain's membership of the EU yet, but already there are squabbles, have been for ages, between the campaigns around figures. The latest disputed statistic is around whether British firms benefit from EU membership. Stuart Rose, chairman of the Britain Stronger in Europe, says the EU is worth an average of £670,000 in extra trade to every UK business exporting or importing within the bloc. He used data published by the Centre for European Reform think tank, which found UK goods trade with the EU was 55% higher because of EU membership. However, one campaign group on the other side, Vote Leave, said this was nonsense. And in fact, the single market has failed to have a significant impact on export growth. They point to research by think tank Civitas, who found membership of the EU has had no discernible benefit for UK exports, proved not far short of a disaster for Britain. There are other disputed figures too. Britain Stronger in Europe say Britain's EU membership costs a net average of £140 per person per year. But Vote Leave put the cost at £350 million a week. I might have left the million off the last one, by using the gross figure. And Britain Stronger in Europe say 13% of laws are made in Brussels, whereas Vote Leave put this figure much higher, between 65 and 75%. Well, let's talk now to Will Straw, who's the Executive Director of Britain Stronger in Europe, and to Robert Oxley, who's Head of Media for Vote Leave. Welcome to both of you. Will Straw, Stuart Rose says membership of the EU is worth an average of £670,000 to British businesses. How do you calculate that figure?
Well, this is based on an independent study that the Centre for European Reform have done. What they have looked at is the impact of being part of the European Union, against counterfactual of not being in the European Union, of what it's meant for our trade performance. They think it's given a 55% boost to our trade. You take that total number, 133 million, and you divide it by the number of trading businesses in the UK, around 200,000. And by the way, this is just looking at goods, not services. And what you get is an average figure of 670,000 per business. Of course, it will be bigger for some, smaller for others, but the average figure is 670,000.
But it is a statistical model. I mean, it is theoretical, isn't it, in that sense?
Well, it's based on real numbers. It's based on taking an estimate. You're right that you look at what the impact of being in the EU has done. And it's absolutely the case that there'll be the other side putting counterfactuals across. But what I'd say is look at what businesses are saying in this debate. The overwhelming majority of businesses, big and small, entrepreneurs and larger, more established businesses, are saying that it is in Britain's interests to be in the European Union because certainly of the trade, the low prices, the jobs it creates and investment. So let's broaden out this argument beyond the back and forth you're bound to get in this debate and look at what are businesses and other people actually saying about the benefits of being in the European Union.
Not all businesses, of course, say that. But if you look at those figures in terms of it being a model, that's how you come up with those sorts of calculations, it's fairly powerful, isn't it? £670,000 to British business. You wouldn't be able to match that if the UK came out of the EU.
Well, I do wonder what is it about the pro-EU, EU-funded Centre for European Reform.
Why do you say, hang about, why do you say EU-funded?
I was kind enough to let you speak.
So you don't think that is an independent model?
You can pick a number from there and it focuses just on trade. It ignores exports, such in services, which makes up a large part of the economy. If you actually look at the overall British exports, the key figure that we're looking at, British exports to the EU market, about 45%. It's declining, as is the share of the EU's share of world GDP. So there are numbers which absolutely show that actually the EU is a declining relevance to British markets.
But you don't dispute the numbers themselves, except you are saying that there are other things you could look at.
It's a case of which facts you cherry pick, right. And you can see the ones which the in-campaign have picked. If you actually look at a truly independent report which has come out today, it says that actually the EU has been dismal for export growth for the UK. And we're very clear that if we vote to leave, if we take the safe option, that actually we'll do that free trade deal. A free trade deal that the Centre for European Reform in this very report, admittedly it's 2 years old, but that's the figures that BSE have decided to use. They say that a free trade deal would actually happen. So
right. Well, we'll get on to the free trade deals then. I mean, if you are saying it would be a disaster if Britain were to leave the EU, it is true to say that bilateral deals could be set up, have been set up by other countries. There'd be no reason for the EU not to set up bilateral treaties with the UK that would equal the sort of money we currently make.
Well, I think this is exactly where the debate needs to go. What is it actually that the other side of the argument, those wanting to leave, want Britain's trading relationship to be with the EU? Do they want to be like Norway or Switzerland, countries outside the EU that have access to the single market but still accept free movement, still make a budget contribution?
Let's stick to the trade. If they did, on the basis of those two countries that you've just mentioned, do you agree they would be able to make, and British business would still be able to benefit to the tune of the sort of figures that you're talking about? Let's forget about the other things that they would be obliged to do.
Well, we have absolutely no idea what trade deals are being negotiated. Let's be clear about this. The United States Trade Representative has said that if we left the EU, there would not be a trade relationship between the UK and the US. They are only dealing with large blocks of countries like the European Union. In other parts of the world, countries are coming together precisely at this time to act as a bloc and get a better deal for their consumers. And what the other side of the argument can't say is what evidence they have that the countries in the European Union, like Germany and France, would give us a deal that was at least as good as what we've got at the moment.
Well, why wouldn't they when we're such a big market in terms of the EU? But I mean, is what they might say. But to you, Robert, how will you persuade...
Can I just come back on that?
I'll let you come back when Robert's coming. How you don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's every chance of setting up bilateral arrangements, but you don't know, and you can't guarantee it, and you don't know how long it'll take.
Well, I think the only thing that guaranteed in this world is death and taxes. But if you do look at all the incentives, and you look at the independent reports, not just kind of the Eurosceptics, they are clear that every incentive is there for a free trade deal. So it means that if we vote to leave, we do take back control, we can save the 350 million. It's not a risk. It's one of those decisions that we will have to make if we vote to leave. And I think that the message from the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign is that no better relationship is possible. When actually what we're saying is, we have this relationship with the EU, which costs us £350 million a week, enough for a new hospital every week. It limits our democracy because it actually takes decisions away from Westminster. It means our politicians are less accountable, and actually it hurts people in their pockets in terms of more expensive goods. And so it takes those decisions away, and I think actually we could leave. We could do those free trade deals in the same way that Chile and Peru have done those trade deals with the EU. But we could also do those trade deals outside of the EU with those global emerging markets which we're limited from. I think
we can hope for a bit more than Chile and Peru. What we want is the best of both worlds. In the EU, getting the very best deal from the single market, but then also getting new deals with countries like India, like America. We would get on much better terms as a group of 500 million consumers than we would as just 65 million.
I mean, just before you continue, because we will do the cost of EU membership, fascinating as it is. I mean, the difficulty here is getting objective facts, or perhaps it's impossible. So in the end, won't it just come down to people's hearts in this particular issue?
I think that's a real problem. I mean, just listening to these two exchange facts, and another fact I heard this morning is that when the EU does trade deals with other countries, there's bigger growth by countries like Switzerland and Norway with those countries rather than with the EU. We can interpret these statistics in any way. The problem is that Mr. and Mrs. Smith in One Acacia Avenue in Worthing are going to be rather confused by all of this, and at the end of the day we need to have a proper, frank debate based on facts and not scare stories about what might happen.
But what I'm saying is, isn't it impossible to get... They are, neither of these gentlemen I put to you are lying. It is about how you view
the truth.
Well, or how you view the economics. I mean, are they, in your mind, are they telling the truth when it comes to statistics?
I think part of the problem is that you don't know what the counterfactual is. So, we don't know what things would be like if we were outside the European Union. But then I think people would be taking a huge risk if we did come out, because the Prime Minister, the Vote Leave groups, they don't know what world would be like if we were outside. And if I was a business, or if I worked for a business, I would be very concerned about leaving. What would that mean for my job if I trade with Europe? But not just with Europe. As Will has said, if you trade with the US, are we going to get those trade relationships that we had before? And also, if we are going to have access to those free markets that we have at the moment, the reality is we are going to have to pay into the system, so the extra hospital a week just won't be there. But
is that how you see it?
Let me just finally say, we will also still be subject to the free movement rules that Norway and Switzerland and others. So, you know,
well,
if
we were to go down the same route as Norway and Switzerland,
but without knowing that, it's a massive risk.
Do you
to leave.
feel as uncertain as Rachel does over the prospect if it were to happen?
No, I can see there is a future for the UK outside of the EU. I'm not scared about that. I haven't made my mind up.
You
haven't?
What
the deal is going to be.
What, because it's so substantive?
Well, the way I look at it, and where I think there's a problem with this whole argument, is, and I was at an EU negotiation this morning, is that it's not just about what's good for the UK and Europe. It's got to be about what is good for the whole of the EU. And one point Robert makes absolutely right, is that the EU share of the world GDP is 60% of what it was back in 1990. So there are risks, not just in coming out, but in staying in an increasingly uncompetitive, shrinking part of the
hang on.
Well,
But this is post, of course, the euro. Well, this is post the euro crisis and, of course, the current migration crisis. You can see why people would have concerns. Can I just ask about something specifically, which is the number of the number of laws that are made in Brussels? You put the figure at 13%.
Yeah.
Where do you get that figure from?
That's from the House of Commons library, so you couldn't get much more independent than someone.
But it's only part of the rule book.
Hang on.
It is only part of the rule book there. They're talking about a thing called directives. So those are the ones which the House of Commons looked at the rules that come out of the EU that the UK then has to put through its own parliament. There's a lot of EU rules, in fact, much more than the actual directives, which just go straight into law. So if you actually look at the wider EU rule book, the things which actually just don't go through Parliament, we don't get a chance to scrutinise or decide how we're going to implement, it is close to 60%. So that 11% figure is
But
is
how
from the
much
House
of an
Commons
impact do
library,
they
but it's
actually have on
totally
the
bogus.
UK, though? I mean, in terms of a lot of those regulations that cover the whole of the EU won't necessarily have any major impact on the UK, and they would have been the sorts of things the UK would have passed anyway.
If you look at the cost, when you pass a regulation like that, they actually do a cost impact assessment. And that puts it at closer to 70 billion. And that's excluding the kind of regulations such as on green issues and working time directives, which I know Will is going to talk about.
Are you being misleading?
No, so the problem with this argument is it only looks at one side of the equation. It looks at the costs. But what the European Union, as our government would do in bringing in any regulation, is look at the cost-benefit analysis. What are the benefits of these regulations? So regardless of what the figure, this side would love to get rid of all those regulations that actually protect workers, that give us paid holidays, that give us maternity and paternity leave. So one person's cost is another person's benefit. We need to be very careful in throwing these figures around to make sure we're looking at the entirety of the picture.
Rob,
I'm afraid they don't do
just
that.
very briefly, because that is the question. You talk about regulations, never actually say what those regulations are, and that they could be regulations that a lot of people value.
Well, I said very specifically that I was excluding the ones on green and social employment. But actually, if we're going to talk about these decisions, where should they be made? Should they be made in Brussels or should they be made in Westminster? Me and Will will probably disagree outside of the EU debate about how certain rules are done in this country. But the point is, we don't get to vote for people who make those decisions.
Gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to have to finish it there.
I've been